Chapter 8, Re-Education. Most of the staff from the Central Intelligence Organization who could not evacuate gathered at the headquarters on the morning of May 2nd, 1975. However, instead of being inside the offices as usual, we were standing in the yard. We had to report to the so-called Military Management Committee of the Provisional Revolutionary Government. Everyone tried to maintain a calm demeanor, but the anxiety on their faces was unmistakable. Despite the large crowd in the yard, an oppressive silence hung over the scene. People whispered cautiously, as if afraid their words might be overheard. Contrary to my expectations, Tuan, Bon, and most of my colleagues like Nan, Trung, Tam, Tri, Lam, and Vin were still there. I thought they, being single or almost single, would have found it easy to escape aboard a ship. However, it seemed they had put too much faith in the evacuation plan of the organization, a plan that was incomplete and led to this tragic situation. At this point, everyone could only entrust their lives to chance. After filling out our names on a sheet of paper placed on a table in the middle of the yard, my wife and I approached Lynn and Lon, my sister-in-law and her husband. We had destroyed our documents the previous night, so we could not submit them as requested by the clerk at the table. I didn't know the clerk, but some people told me he was Colonel Kwong, formerly the chief of security for the organization. I wasn't sure if he was a communist infiltrator or simply an opportunist. I walked past Tuan and Bon. They only nodded at me without saying a word. Their usual laughter was gone, replaced by bittersweet smiles. For the first time, we had to squat on the ground, waiting our turn to handle the paperwork. Long, a former recruitment office staff member, called out names from a list. We approached in turn to sign a paper placed on a table near the medical office, next to the parking lot, from May 2nd to June 14th. I remember reporting to the communist officials who had taken over the Central Intelligence Organization twice. The first time, I don't recall the exact date. They sent 2 plainclothes officers to my mother's house to take me to an old office on Tran Bin Trong Street. There, they asked me to write down everything I knew about the period from 1969 to 1972, when I infiltrated student groups to get close to the Saigon Student Union led by Huynh Tan Mam. They kept me there from morning until 6 p.m. before taking me home, requiring me to pay for my own lunch. The second time, they sent a letter summoning me to an old safe house of Division A17 on Phan Tan John Street. There, I met Nguyen Ta, who had worked with me in Division Z and was now in charge of taking over the organization. This meeting occurred just days before I was summoned for re-education. That time, I didn't have to write anything. Nguyen Ta advised me to report for re-education as instructed by the Provisional Revolutionary Government to receive the leniency of the socialist state. Since then, the term re-education became ubiquitous. Re-education of thoughts, lifestyle, society, economy, and so on was announced daily on radio and television. Southern soldiers were said to be released after 3 days of re-education. Southern non-commissioned officers would be released after 7 days, while officers from second lieutenant to captain would require 10 days. Officers ranked major or higher, government officials from department heads to the president, as well as mid and high-level intelligence officers, were to undergo 1 month of re-education. According to the announcement from the Provisional Revolutionary Government, our reporting schedule was from June 13th to June 15th at Chu Van and High School. We were required to pay 14,000 Vien Dong for a month's food and bring blankets, clothes, and other necessities. Everything seemed logical. The communists selected schools as reporting venues and designated reasonable durations for each rank. Although we didn't trust their words, we clung to the hope that they might be truthful. What else could we do under such circumstances? Where could we even escape to? We had considered ourselves as good as dead since April 30th. June 13th was a Friday, an unlucky day. June 14th was a Dragon Boat Festival, the 5th day of the 5th lunar month, also considered unlucky for Vietnamese people. We decided to report on June 14th, hoping that two misfortunes might somehow cancel each other out and bring good fortune. I had no money to pay, so I had to pawn my wedding ring for funds. It felt like a cruel joke, but it was a bitter reality I had to endure. On the bus ride from my mother's house to Chu Van High School, an old man noticed our bulky luggage and asked where we were going. I replied, to re-education camp. He gave us a strange smile and wished us luck. At the time, I couldn't decipher the meaning of his smile, but I guessed it was pity. It wasn't just the two of us reporting for re-education. Our unborn child in my wife's womb was coming along too. Friends and colleagues stood in front of the school. Lon and Lynn, my sister-in-law and her husband, had reported the previous day after entrusting their two young sons, ages 4 and 1, to their grandparents. Looking at my wife's pregnant belly, I wonder how she would endure a month of re-education, even if it were just a month as promised. But then, I reminded myself that everyone had their own hardships. For us, life had already ended on Liberation Day. The rest was just a hopeless existence. The boundary between life and death was merely a term. With that mindset, we embarked on our first day of re-education, joking with friends that the sooner you go, the sooner you return. Chu Van High School, where we reported for re-education, was a place I had known well. It was a school I attended in 1963 during my final year of high school. That year was marked by political upheaval. The coup against President No Din Diem orchestrated by Duong Van Minh with American backing. Now, 12 years later, I returned to the same school under vastly different circumstances. As fate would have it, Duong Van Minh himself was nearby, confined in the Minh Mang dormitory, alongside other high-ranking officers of the fallen South Vietnamese regime. Standing at the entrance of the school, I saw familiar faces among the crowd. Lon and Lynn, my wife's sister and brother-in-law, had already reported the day before, leaving their two young sons in the care of their grandparents. I glanced at my wife's growing belly and worried silently about how she would endure even a single month of re-education, as promised by the authorities. But then again, each person had their own burdens to bear. For us, survival seemed already a distant hope since the day of liberation. As we crossed the threshold of the school, I tried to lighten the somber mood with a wry comment to friends nearby. Those who come early will leave early. It was a hollow jest, yet it helped diffuse the tension for a moment. Chu Van High School was situated across from the Na Sao Church on Minh Mang Street in District 5, Saigon. From the school's courtyard, I could see the headquarters of the Saigon Student Union on Hong Bang Street, a place I had frequented regularly during my work from 1969 to 1975. The school itself had two buildings, each 2 stories tall. My wife and I were assigned to the first building. From there, I had a clear view of the bustling street outside. The women were assigned to the first-floor classrooms, including my wife, who ended up in the very classroom I had studied in 12 years earlier. The irony of life struck me deeply. While helping my wife settle in, I noted the kindness of the women around her. Former colleagues like Nak, Lu, and Ba, who had worked with my wife in the recruitment office, reassured me they would look after her. Their support offered a small measure of comfort. After ensuring my wife was as comfortable as possible, I returned to find my assigned space. The classroom I entered was devoid of desks, chairs, or any remnants of its past purpose. I unrolled a straw mat in the corner, where the teacher's podium used to stand. Each person was allotted just enough space for a mat. My small backpack became my pillow and a constant companion throughout the re-education experience. lasting not just a month, but 17 years. The content of that backpack were modest: a nylon mosquito net, a military-style nylon blanket, 2 pairs of jeans, 2 shirts, a water canteen, a poncho, 10 packets of instant noodles, a bag of dried rice, a packet of dried meat, and a small medical kit containing Tylenol, penicillin, antidiarrheal medicine, quinine, and adhesive tape. I had prepared for a life in the wilderness rather than in the city. What I regretted not packing was a hammock, which I would come to realize was essential. As I sat in the empty classroom, my thoughts drifted to my old classmates, some lost to the war, others scattered across the globe, and perhaps some enduring the same fate as me. The familiarity of the school brought a strange sense of déjà vu, but it was tinged with the grim reality of our present circumstances. The term re-education carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. Conversation swirled around its meaning, but no one dared to say aloud what we all suspected. Re-education was a guise for retribution. The stories we had heard of communist brainwashing techniques or their so-called re-education camps were vague yet ominous. Books like Trey Damn Dumb, Damn Done Camp by Southern writers painted a dire picture, but the true nature of this process remained shrouded in mystery. Some compared it to the fate of the Cossacks in the Soviet Union, sent to Siberia for re-education, never to return. Others drew parallels to the fate of nationalist Chinese, supporters exiled to remote regions under communist rule. Still, we knew little about what had happened to those in North Vietnam who resisted Ho Chi Minh's regime, whether they had been executed or languished in camps. I doubted the Vietnamese communists would conduct large-scale massacres like those perpetrated by Hitler in Nazi death camps. Such acts would draw too much international attention. Instead, they seemed to favor a subtler, more insidious form of destruction, one that eroded lives slowly and quietly. Entering the re-education camp, we had to brace ourselves for the worst, even if that meant death. The terms brainwashing and re-education became synonymous in my mind. How would the communists transform the minds of their enemies? The pervasive message was that Southern citizens, having lived under the influence of American imperialism and the so-called puppet regime, needed ideological purification to adapt to the new socialist society. Yet the methods remained elusive. Each day brought new regulations and prohibitions. Young men were forced to cut their flared trousers. Women were barred from wearing traditional AO dye, Vietnamese dress, or using makeup. Yellow music was banned outright, and books published in South Vietnam were branded as reactionary and decadent, destined for destruction. Society was to be reshaped through labor, with income dictated by effort, a core tenet of their economic restructuring. For us, the most pressing concern was ideological re-education. Lectures painted a stark picture of the crimes of American imperialists and the puppet government, contrasted against the triumphs of revolution and socialism. Although we harbored doubts, we clung to the hope that the promised timeline of re-education might hold true. In desperate circumstances, even the faintest glimmer of optimism becomes a lifeline. We had no means of escape, no place to hide. Surrendering ourselves to the enemy's will, we entered the re-education process with no choice but to endure whatever fate awaited us. Chapter 9. An event more peculiar. A few vans bearing the names of well-known restaurants in Saigon, such as Bak Hai, Dai La Din Dong Con, and Mandarin, drove into the school grounds. Male and female attendants dressed in white uniforms arranged food on tables set up in the front yard near the main gate. Then, from a loudspeaker hung on the first building, came an announcement inviting the camp inmates to have their dinner. Those who had been there since the previous day approached the dining tables naturally, while the newcomers hesitated and awkwardly followed. I, along with few teammates, went to the table marked Bach High, picked up some food into a bowl, and sat down to eat with my wife. My wife's sister mentioned that the day before, they had explained that the meals were funded by our own contributions. Since the camp did not yet have its own kitchen, food had to be purchased from restaurants to serve us. The explanation sounded reasonable, but as we observed their soldiers guarding the camp eating plain meals of water spinach and fish sauce on aluminum trays, doubts crept into our minds. What exactly is going on here? It seemed absurd. Could this be a facade to deceive the people of Saigon? Or perhaps, for the foreign journalists outside, a convenient opportunity to showcase the Communist Party's so-called humanitarian policies? After the Vietnam War ended, foreign journalists continued to observe and report on the events unfolding under the so-called liberation of Communist Vietnam. The Vietnam War, being the largest conflict since World War II, provided communists with endless opportunities for global propaganda, just as they had done during the war. Foreign journalists were always a critical medium for them to execute this strategy. Who could truly know what was happening behind the Iron Curtain? I cannot believe they would treat us this way without ulterior motives. Communists always use one action to conceal another. What will happen to us once they achieve their goal of publicizing their humanitarian policies toward their enemies? We were all waiting in anxious anticipation of what was to come.